Iran is a very diverse country. It's multilingual. It has Arabs, for example. It has Turks. There are Baluch. There are many Kurds in Iran. So it's multilingual, very, very diverse from region to region. But there is a sense of Iranian identity based on the history of the country. There has been something known as Iran or Persia for something like 5,000 years. So that gives them a great deal of pride. Iran is extraordinary, let me say. It is a 5,000-year-old civilization. It is one of the oldest cultures in the world. And Iranians have a very strong sense of who they are. They're very proud of their language, their poetry, their contributions in music and architecture, in other cultural fields. There's a very strong sense of Iraniyat, being Iranian.
The internet culture in Iran is huge. The youth music culture is huge. Western music and movie culture, it's enormous. The raves, the parties, the underground culture is amazing, and it's only barely underground.
خیلی سخته. از اکباتانوس چی اومدین اینجا؟
یادم 3 بار گرفتم.
ریختن 3 طبقه زیر زمین بود، به هیچ کسی شازایی نمی‌رسید. ریختن سازا رو برداشتن بردن، فهم ما هم نبودیم. بعد این کنسرت کذایی
همون پس یه جور شد.
That Iranian cinema has become widely admired throughout the world, and it's gone through a period of a kind of a renaissance, I would say. Ahmad Shamlou was one of the foremost poets, I would say, of contemporary Persian literature. When he died in the year 2000, within hours, there were thousands and thousands of people. To some accounts, there were about 100,000 people there that day, which seems quite interesting to Americans when I tell them, oh, you know, at the poet's funeral, there were 100,000 people, and people are quite surprised about that.
During the war, in the first decade after the revolution, the Islamic regime had banned American movies because it considered them as cultural invasion. But we were frustrated at turning on the television and just seeing clerics preach. So there was a new job in Iran, and there were these young, motivated men, entrepreneurs, who would secretly pirate American movies, Hollywood movies, and bring them to people's homes, and we would rent them. Rayman was very popular. Whatever was coming out, we used to watch the Oscars like within a week after the Academy Award was given out. So we would put our fingers on the movies that were winning the awards and wanted to see those. But we were watching all the other ones as well, movies that were taped off cable programs, MTV shows.
People are living a Western lifestyle in everything but the way they walk around on the streets. There is a tremendous desire to create a political system in which they'll be able to do that openly instead of having to do it behind closed doors.
What does it mean for sanctions to work? And what is the role of sanctions in trying to produce the outcome we want? I mean, people focus on sanctions, more pressure, more pressure, more pressure.
The sanctions have completely crippled Iranian civil society in ways that it hasn't crippled Iranian regime. So if the sanctions were aimed at undermining the Islamic regime, it has helped the regime. People just don't have time to think about human rights, about freedom, about democracy, when they have to worry about bringing food on their tables.
The pro-democracy movement, the backbone of it, according to themselves, is the middle class. And the middle class has been hit really hard, perhaps the hardest when it comes to these sanctions. This is part of the reason why the leaders of the pro-democracy movement from the very beginning came out opposed to the sanctions, saying that this will hurt the pro-democracy movement because it will hurt its backbone, the middle class. And we have seen that. We have testimonies from people who used to be very active 3-4 years ago, organizing, who said, 4 years ago, I was only thinking about social and political freedoms. Today, I'm too preoccupied just trying to make ends meet. I don't have time to focus on the political issues because my economy is such a bad shape as a direct result of the sanctions.
Many policymakers don't want to fight a war. They don't want boots in the ground. They don't want to stand back and sit on their hands and do nothing because that makes them look weak. So sanctions are something everyone, Democrats, Republicans, mothers and fathers, children and grandparents can all get around, to do sanctions. But sanctions alone, by themselves, are almost never the answer to a policy problem. Sanctions, to the extent that they're effective, when they were effective with South Africa, when they were effective with Libya, to change behavior, they're part of an integrated approach in which the end result is a diplomatic settlement. There are very few countries that you press down on them and then they say, you're right, we give in, we wave the white flag, we'll do whatever you want. That does not happen in international politics. When sanctions work, they work because there's sanctions and there's diplomacy and there are other things going on as part of an integrated strategy that in the end produces a diplomatic agreement that all sides, including the sanctioned party, can get on board with. There's no law that bans the import of medicines or humanitarian goods into Iran. None of that is being sanctioned. And so in theory, Iran should have access to all of that. What we focused on instead is going after banking, shipping insurance, containers, that sort of thing. One of the problems, though, is the banks are private entities. They can decide what they want to do and what they don't want to do. And because there are all these sanctions laws around banking, they don't want to have anything to do with Iran. So even though it's perfectly legal for them to finance the purchase and transfer of humanitarian-related items, drugs and medical supplies, as private businesses, they're saying, we just don't want any part of this. We don't want to get involved in something where we're going to end up in court or the subject of some sort of investigation or penalty. So we don't want to be involved.
But there was no medicine shortage until the sanctions hit. And it's important to understand that it's not a chicken and egg problem, as some people have said. It's a bad situation that was turned into a deadly situation as a result of the sanctions. And I think this is something that from the Western side, there needs to be much more focus on because Iran is a country in which the population tends to have a relatively benign or positive view of the United States. If you have several years of this taking place in which children are dying from the simplest of diseases because there's no access to medicine, you're not going to end up creating friends or winning any hearts and minds in that country.
Iranians, just like any other nation in the world, they want to have access to information, technology, medicine, everything. And the sanctions are undermining Iranian society, not the government.
This is a country that fought a long and bloody war against Iraq under very difficult circumstances, including Saddam's use of chemical weapons. So they're not going to fold easily.
In September of 1980, with the blessing of the United States, Saddam Hussein attacked Iran. Iran had not invaded another country in 250 years. The war was brutal, with extensive trench warfare, and it lasted almost a decade.
Saddam always had hegemonic dreams in the Middle East. While the Shah was in power, it wasn't possible for him to realize these dreams. Suddenly, Iran was in turmoil. And not only was it taken over by mullahs, but they shot the generals, those that weren't smart enough to flee. One day Saddam woke up and looked over and he said, they don't have any generals. There's no army to speak of. I can take them over. It didn't turn out to be quite that easy, but that's how the war began. Then there was a great alarm in Washington. What do we do? And they finally realized, well, this is our chance to get at Iran. Don't forget that the hostage crisis was going on. This was a period when the United States was in a fanatic anti-Iran mood. And so we embraced Saddam. The President of the United States, Ronald Reagan, sent an envoy to meet personally with Saddam Hussein. He went twice. That envoy was Donald Rumsfeld. And Rumsfeld asked Saddam, what can we do for you to help you defeat Iran? Saddam asked for a couple of things. He wanted surveillance photographs so that he could see where the Iranian troop concentrations were and attack them. And he wanted helicopters. Obviously always good in a close quarter war like that. So the United States did supply intelligence and helicopters to Saddam during that war. And when Iranians run down their list of grievances about the United States, the fact that we were helping Saddam during that horrific 8-year war against Iran is certainly on the list.
I was in 3rd grade, elementary school, when the war broke out. All I can tell you that it was the most horrifying experience of my life. The war started with the bombing of the city, so every night we had to run down our stairs as we heard the sound of the siren, take refuge somewhere safe from the Iraqi bombers that were dropping bombs. It took a while for us to get used to living in a war condition. We put tapes on our windows to sort of limit their shattering in case the bombers dropped a bomb in an area close to our homes. We were always ready to run down the stairs to take shelter. But after a while, we got used to it. We learned how to deal with it. But it was painful that it dragged on for such a long time, for long, 8 years. There was a constant reminder of the bloodshed, of the violence. And these things affect people's souls, especially if they drag on for so many years, almost a decade. The war with Iraq was the longest war in modern history. It left so many people killed, crippled. It affected us in many direct ways. After the war ended, when you go back to Iran's history in the 90s, our first uprising occurred in 1999. That means it took over 10 years for Iranian civil society to come back into action, to put itself together, to come up with ideas, with notions what it wants and where it wants to go.
It's important to remember that Iran is it's a theocracy, right? It's run by a cleric. It's not run by the president. I mean, the president is one of several government institutions in Iran that has power, but the most important, by far, governmental institution in Iran is the supreme leader, who is a religious figure elected by a group of other religious figures. So, in a religious country, religious decrees are important. And then going back to the Iran-Iraq War, what was then the bloodiest war on record in the region, Iraq, Saddam Hussein used chemical weapons against Iran. Iran did not respond with chemical weapons. The military went to the leader at the time and said, we want to be able to retaliate with chemical weapons, and the military was told, no, that's irreligious, you can't do that. So these things, in a theocracy, religious morals and principles can matter. And they did for the Iran-Iraq War.
I'm against Iran having nuclear weapons. I'm against any new country getting weapons that don't have them. And I'm even in favor of countries that have nuclear weapons complying with their part of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty and getting rid of them. We shouldn't be moving towards more, we should be moving towards less. In fact, this is the concept of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. It's essentially a deal between the countries that have the nuclear weapons and the ones that don't. The ones that don't promise not to try to get them. And the ones that do promise that they will build down their arsenals to the point with the goal of trying to reach nothing.
I think nuclear weapons are inherently evil. I think they did restrain the U.S. and the Soviet Union in a rough way during a bumpy part of the Cold War. But ultimately, if you hold on to these weapons long enough, they're going to be used, and when they're used, millions of innocent people will be killed. And I believe in the NPT. I think everyone should follow it. So I think the nuclear weapons states should give up their nuclear weapons, not tomorrow, but be committed to a process that produces disarmament. And I think the states that don't have nuclear weapons should maintain their commitments and not get nuclear weapons. But if we have an Iran with nuclear weapons, that makes the world a more dangerous place because nuclear weapons are inherently dangerous. I think it could make the Middle East a more dangerous place. Those weapons could eventually be used by accident or in a crisis or through mistakes or miscalculation. But it also means the road to disarmament becomes much more complicated because the more states that acquire nuclear weapons, the more reluctant the countries that already have them, the US, China, France, Israel, all those countries become more reluctant to living up to their obligations. When the Shah was in charge of Iran, the US was encouraging the Shah to develop nuclear power. In fact, the Shah bought into part of an enrichment consortium, and that fell apart after the Shah was deposed. But in the 70s, when nuclear power was going to solve all our problems, the US and Europe was pressing Iran to develop nuclear energy, even though it had oil. And the argument was, well, if you can supply your own electricity, then you can sell more oil, export more oil, and make more money off it. It was an argument that we made to them in the 1970s, and now it's an argument that they fully embraced. So it's difficult for us to come back and say, oh, you really don't need to do that.
And what does weaponization mean, and where does Iran stand on that end of things?
Well, it's a great question to ask about weaponization because people think, bang, you get a bomb once you've enriched 90% uranium. And really, we're talking about a process here. I mean, even if you think about North Korea's had nuclear tests, but does it have a reliable, workable, military-grade nuclear weapon? The answer, in my view, is no. The U.S. military certainly wouldn't want to take the devices that North Korea has and incorporate them into the U.S. arsenal. So it's really a continuum here. And Iran is along that continuum, but not very far down. So in everyone's best estimate, Iran has not yet made a decision to build nuclear weapons. So there is no weaponization going on. They haven't made a decision to go down that path yet. They could decide to do so at some point in the future, but they have not made that decision, and that's a critical distinction. Once they make that decision, then they're going to have to, well, in this particular case, they'll probably have to kick out all the inspectors. They'd have to go through, a lot of different steps, but technically speaking, they would enrich uranium to 90%. They would fashion a crude nuclear device. They would test that device. Based on the results of that test, they would figure out what they were doing right, what they were doing wrong. And Iran, if it decided to go to this point, had a nuclear test, then fashioned a nuclear weapon, would probably, like every state in the nuclear age, first to fashion a bomb that would be dropped from a plane. And then it would be sometime later, generations later, in terms of the design, generations later, where they would then fashion, if this is what their goal was, a warhead that was small enough to fit onto a missile. And then you'd have to have a missile that was highly reliable enough that you can't take chances with nuclear weapons. So you can't really put a warhead on the tip of a missile, fire the missile, and have the missile fail and come tumbling back onto your own country. So the level of reliability here is quite high. Well, nuclear weapons, like chemical weapons, are, if you look at the Abrahamic traditions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, deeply morally problematic because they kill innocents, they destroy the land, they violate all these moral precepts that are at the core of all three Abrahamic traditions, and even more so for Islam than for Christianity. So there have been statements about nuclear weapons being irreligious and haram, being unacceptable, morally unacceptable, forbidden. The president, Ahmadinejad, has mentioned these. The supreme leader has given speeches where he's mentioned it. There's been talk of a fatwa, but no one in the USA has actually seen the text of the fatwa, this religious ruling about the illegitimacy of nuclear weapons. But our Iranian colleagues who are clerics insist that there is a fatwa and are producing materials that they hope to send to be able to demonstrate that this is the case. The U.S. has been sanctioning Iran since the hostage crisis, 1979 hostage crisis. And we've been engaged in tussling over Iran's nuclear program since the late 1990s, and then we've had international involvement, UN Security Council resolutions and that sort of thing since the early 2000s. So this has been going on for, more than a decade, more than 2 decades. So you could hardly call this a race to the bomb. We know because of IAEA inspections, the International Atomic Energy Agency is on the ground every couple of weeks in Iran. Iran is the most watched country in the world. More so than North Korea. IAEA is on the ground. They issue quarterly reports. The Russians are on the ground. The Americans are spying. The Israelis are spying. The Saudis are spying. Everyone is looking at this. And we have a lot of great data about their facilities. And every time they've started to build a facility, even when they haven't announced it, we've known about it in advance.
I think the vast majority of Iranian Americans support the idea that Iran has to become a democracy. They also support the idea that the democracy has to come from within ultimately. It cannot come from outside. Doesn't mean that outside cannot play a helpful role, but it can play the leading role. I think part of the reason why the word regime change, which is used by a lot of people, but it has a connotation that in my personal view is insufficient, is because regime change just means that you change the regime. It doesn't mean that you change the regime for the better. I like the word democratization. I like the word that makes it very clear, where are you heading? You're heading towards a democracy. That has to be the end goal. Regime change is what Iran had in 1979. A dictatorship was thrown out and another dictatorship was put in place. Doing that again, to me, is not particularly valuable. It has to have a positive objective that is very clear from the very outset, and that's why I think the term democratization is more fitting. Also, regime change has a connotation that is done by the US. That is yet another one of those US-led initiatives, and that I don't think would be successful. I don't doubt that there may be a lot of positive intentions. My doubt is America's capability to positively change a regime in the Middle East and make it sustainable and make it democratic. I have doubts about that, and I think there's plenty of examples in just the last couple of years that regardless of the intent, the capability and capacity simply isn't there.
Oh, that it were so easy, but I think actually regime change is unlikely. It's difficult to pull off even if you can start down that path, and you're not necessarily going to get the result that you hope for. And in the meantime, you have a very angry country that probably will decide the next day to pursue nuclear weapons.
Over history, you see that there are effectively 3 models for government of Iran. One is military dictatorship, one is religious rule, and one is, we could call it Mossadegh-style liberal democracy. We're now in a period where we've gone through a quarter of a century of military rule, followed by more than a quarter of a century of religious rule. I sense that many Iranians are feeling like it's time to keep this cycle going and get back to the kind of government that Mossadegh was trying to build in the 50s. Iran's challenge, and I think as many Iranians would feel it, is to try to get back to where we were when the CIA intervention threw us off track in 1953 and start to build the democracy now that we would have tried to build in 1954 and 55 and the years afterward.
The majority of the population in Iran don't like the current regime. The Iranian society is at a stage that no matter what, the regime has to comply with some kind of change. The society is much more ahead of the Iranian government. During the 2009 uprising, the children of many of high-ranking officials were taking part in the demonstrations. Their children were arrested and they were in prison, and newspapers were reporting them. How can you expect a regime whose own children go into prison because they are against the status quo?
The decision about the direction of Iran's government has to lie in the end with the people of Iran. It's not their job to come up with a government or a regime that we like or that looks good to us. Iran has been around as a nation about 10 times longer than the United States, if you want to count it all the way back to its Persian background. Iranians have a very strong sense of themselves and their history.
I have no doubt that democracy will come to Iran very slowly, gradually, but it will be grassroots. And if there is a war, that's going to be delayed for a very long time. That's why a war is scary.